After the once-in-a-generation property boom of 2020-21, Australia's property markets are cooling off. How long is that going to last? What's happened? What's changed? What does it mean for the future of our property markets? To help you understand what's ahead, and if our property markets are going to crash, as some are suggesting, in today's podcast I want to outline the dynamics and the economics of Australia's property markets, what causes property values to increase, and what makes them fall. And I want to do this to help you ensure that your investments outperform the market averages over the long term. Now, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know I generally have guests on, but today this topic is so important, it's just going to be you and me as I share with you what causes property markets to boom and to bust. So, welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
We're now in the cooling off, the adjustment phase of the property cycle. And if you believe most of what the media tells you, it's all got to do with interest rates, hasn't it? But I don't agree. So to help you understand what's ahead for our property markets and why I don't believe the markets are going to crash, like some are suggesting, I want to share with you a number of the myriad financial, social and political factors that will impact on what the value of your home or your next investment property or your current investment properties will be worth. I want to show you that it's a lot more than interest rates. Now, if we want to look at what's going to increase the value of properties in the short term, there's no doubt that interest rates are an important factor. Obviously, low interest rates make it easy for buyers to borrow more. Money's cheaper. But interestingly, the converse isn't true, and we've discussed this on previous podcasts, where in the past, property values continue to rise, and in fact for some time, despite the RBA raising interest rates in the past. This particular cycle, property values peaked early in 2021 and started to drop in Sydney and Melbourne before interest rates went up. And despite interest rates rising, there are myriad of markets around Australia, small ones and large capital cities, that are still increasing in value despite rising interest rates. So it's a lot more than just interest rates. But yeah, there's no doubt that one of the factors that causes property values to rise in the short term is interest rates. Another factor that pushes up property values, and we always talk about it, is supply and demand. Generally, if demand for accommodation outweighs supply, property values rise. But if supply outstrips demand, such as when we build too many apartments, property values tend to fall. Now, at the moment, it's the opposite. There's actually a severe shortage of properties. You can see that in rental accommodation, with vacancy rates being very low and rents rising, and there's very few new towers coming out of the ground. So as we talk about the reasons that push property values up in the short term, in other words, what creates the cycles as opposed to the factors that create long-term growth, which I'm going to discuss in a moment, the next one I'd like to just mention to you, of course, is the availability and the cost of land. The lengthy time it takes to release new land supplies and the vast amount of taxes and charges that developers have to pay when they subdivide new estates is one of the factors that contributes to rising house prices around Australia. Now, we've spoken a bit about finance a moment ago when I talked about interest rates, but interestingly, it's actually more than interest rates that affect property values. It's really access to credit, the availability of credit, that makes a big difference. Rising rates tend to prompt lenders to tighten their lending standards to make sure that borrowers can service their loans. Think about it, back in, I think it was 2016-17, APRA started to tighten the screws when there was a steep increase in property investors. There was a period of time, 2014, 15, 16, where it got to the point where investors made up about 50% of all purchases in Sydney. That was a speculative boom, and APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, instructed the banks and other lenders to be more cautious and set stricter criteria for determining whether borrowers could repay their loans if interest rates were going to change. And you may remember what they did was tighten the screws on investors in particular, and it caused property values to drop, particularly in Sydney where they dropped around 10%, and in Melbourne as well. On the flip side, during the recent pandemic, banks eased their lending standards in a move designed to free up credit and to revive the economy. And it worked, and that's one of the reasons property values surged. Now, interest rates are going up, but there's still that barrier, that buffer that APRA has asked the banks to put on all borrowers. They have to be able to borrow even if interest rates go up another 3%. Well, that was relevant a year or two ago because interest rates are going to go up about the 3% from their historic lows, their wartime lows of almost zero. Having said that, I think APRA is going to loosen the screws a bit and bring their buffers back to maybe 1.5%, 2%, 1.75% like they used to be. So as we're talking about the factors that you need to understand as a property investor that drive our property values, the general economic climate is another important one. Here I'm talking about things like employment or unemployment and inflation. When the economy is doing well, when people have got jobs, when they feel secure, they look to improve their financial situation. They look to upgrade their home, and that's one of the factors that created the boom over the last couple of years. But at the moment, with the economic uncertainty and the Reserve Bank telling us interest rates are going to keep going up and it wants to slow the economy and it wants some people to lose their jobs, clearly that's going to be one of the factors that affects consumer confidence and slows down our property markets. Now, that's another factor, one of the many factors that affect our property markets, consumer confidence. In fact, I think it almost sums up all of them. Consumer confidence is a big factor in us making decisions, big decisions, like buying a home, buying an investment property, buying a car. So increasing consumer confidence increases consumer spending and eventually creates, I guess it's a sort of herd mentality, isn't it? When everyone feels comfortable, there's just people go out and spend more. And currently it's the opposite. When we had that robust economic growth a while ago and rising property prices, it created what we call a wealth effect, which led to more consumer confidence, where buyers think it's just a great time to buy property, but currently it's the opposite. The Reserve Bank's doing that on purpose. It's dampening consumer confidence because it doesn't want us to spend as much. It wants to slow down economic growth and inflation. So consumer confidence, it's that old story about fear and greed, isn't it, that drive our markets. A year or so ago, it was FOMO, fear of missing out, that drove the markets. Now it's fear of buying early that's driving our markets. And in a moment, I'm going to explain to you when I see that swapping over. Because when it swaps over, when people feel that interest rates are nearing their peak, when people feel that the economy is now starting to pick up, it's not going to slow down anymore, and inflation's under control, fear will disappear, greed will return, and we're going to find the property markets picking up again. But I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. But I'm at the moment still working through some of the factors that drive property values up in the short term. Another one we've got to consider, and boy did we see a lot of it over the last couple of years, is government incentives. In particular for first home buyers, when the government wants to inject more demand into the market or to employment, it frequently gives incentives to first home buyers. Just look how well that worked during the COVID pandemic when we had the first homeowner grants and the incentives boosted jobs in the construction industry, as well as many other associated retail industries. The government knows that when you buy a new home, you've got to buy carpets and curtains and televisions. So they look at first home buyers as a great way of pumping industry, greasing the wheels of industry, and a new Labor government still has a number of first home buyer schemes, the Help to Buy program, where the government owns a portion of your property, the Home Loan Guarantee Scheme, where you can buy property with 5% deposit, or regional first home buyer support. And these incentives broaden the pool of property buyers, and that sort of flips the supply-demand balance a bit and puts pressure on property values. And another major factor that affects property values is investor appetite. Over the couple of years of the pandemic, investors dropped out a bit, and some are still a little bit nervous at the moment, related to just what's happening in the market, what's happening to interest rates, and some of the, let's call them interesting changes that the state governments are doing. Queensland's changing its land tax regulation as Residential Tenancies Act. Victoria's recently changed its Residential Tenancies Act. Western Australia is planning to make it a bit harder for investors. But investors are an important factor in driving the property markets and particularly the rental markets. But remember, 70% of properties are bought by owner-occupiers, and they're the main ones that drive our property markets. So another important factor to consider when you think, well, what does push property values up? And that's really household formation. We talk a lot about population growth, but it's actually more important when you talk about household formation, because what increases the demand for housing isn't the number of people living in a city or a country, but the number of dwellings needed to accommodate them. Now, this works in a couple of ways. With more young adults staying home longer to save hefty deposits at the moment because it's a bit harder, the trend to more multi-generation households or more friends and families pooling their resources and buying a property together, it's possible in the short term the number of dwellings required may decrease during these more challenging economic times. But on the other hand, there are more older Australians living in one or two people households. Maybe that's going to even out the numbers. But I guess what I'm going through with you, so you understand the factors that drive our property markets that are more than just interest rates, a big one is household formation. And another factor affecting our housing markets over the last couple of years are the myriad millennials who are moving to the next stage of their lives, entering family formation ages, and they're moving from apartments and planning in general to live in houses. Now, interestingly, houses are getting so expensive, some are now moving to townhouses, villa units, or to more family-friendly apartments. So you've heard me speak often about how it's demographics that drive our property market over the long term, much more than the ups and downs of interest rates. And that's why we regularly talk about demographics on this podcast. And projections from the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimate that by the end of this decade, our population is going to approach about 29 million. Now, that's about 1 million less than previously estimated. Since we closed the borders because of COVID, we're not going to get to the 30 million. But there'll be almost 40 million Australians by the middle of the century. In fact, the government's got a business plan to make that happen. I'm sure you know that the government's trying to increase immigration to help the jobs shortage. And remember, all those baby boomers who are going to retire over the next 10, 15, 20 years need to be replaced in the workforce. So what we're going to do is virtually add a Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane to our population over the next 25, 30 years. And they're going to need to live somewhere. And all these migrants, because a lot of them, 70% are probably going to be coming from immigration, they're not going to bring houses with them. So it's actually estimated we're going to need to build one more dwelling for every 3 dwellings that currently exist to accommodate all these people. And we know as our borders have now opened, more and more people are going to be wanting to come to Australia, and they see Australia as a safe nation, politically safe, medically safe, and with a great economic future. Then factor into this equation the current penchant, the desire that we have for knocking down existing dwellings and rebuilding them. So it looks like we're probably going to have to build something like 200,000 new dwellings every single year. Now, we know at the moment the building industry just can't cope with that. So the question is, where are they going to be? How much are they going to cost? What associated infrastructure is going to be necessary for that? And as you can imagine, it's not going to be any cheaper in the future to build these new dwellings. It's only going to get more expensive moving forward, and that's going to push up property values in, well, not just the new properties, of course, but the value of established properties, because the gap can't get that wide. Now, I know that some people say, well, go to those growth corridors, go to those outer suburban areas where all the new people are going to move in. But in general, they tend to be poor capital growth locations. The abundance of new supply is the enemy of capital growth. At the same time, these locations tend to be where new families, where migrants move. And again, it's not a judge of people, but this demographic tends to have little spare cash left over at the end of the month. They're areas where the ability to push up the value of properties is low, and tenants tend to live there because they can't afford to live elsewhere, but they spend a large percentage of their income on their rental. So they can't keep paying more rent. Remember, in the future, your financial independence, your income when you retire on your property portfolio is going to be dependent upon your tenants' ability to pay more rent. So it's going to be really, really important to choose locations where tenants are more affluent and can afford to pay more. So again, we'll keep talking about demographics, and I regularly have Simon Kirstenmacher, one of Australia's leading demographers, on this podcast so you understand what's going on. But in my mind, there are so many more influences on property than just interest rates. That's what I'm wanting to talk you through today, so you understand the sort of research that we do at Metropole when we make decisions about where to invest for ourselves personally and for our clients. Now, of course, we always start by putting a strategic property plan together for our clients. So we don't talk about location or properties in the plan. What's more important is where you are now, where you want to move to in the future, what your end game is, what sort of income you want to achieve, and what is going to happen between now and then. Are you wanting to buy another house? Are you going to stop and have a baby or babies, or what stage of your life you're at the moment? So all that goes into the plan. So we help you bring your future into the present and put a plan together, and then our buyer's agents will help you if you want to implement the plan. And what I'm talking about is some of the homework and research that the next stage needs when we start to help look at location. Now, again, as we're talking about the multiple influences of our property markets, not just interest rates like some people would have you believe, affordability, well, that is a factor, but affordability has a lot more to do than just interest rates. It encompasses dwelling prices, employment or unemployment rates, wages, interest rates, credit supply, GDP growth, inflation. Whether somebody can or can't afford to buy a property is never just the price tag on the property itself. Now, we know that over the last couple of years, record low interest rates meant monthly mortgage repayments for most properties were cheaper than they ever had been. And yes, over that cycle, the value of a lot of properties in Australia increased 25, sometimes 30% in many locations. And we know wages only increased minimally, and we know that wages are not going to keep going up much. The Treasurer, our new Treasurer, has told us that the average Australian is going to have to take a real wage cut. In other words, real wages after inflation aren't going to go up as much. So I believe we're going to end up with a two-tier property market. The more highly skilled and highly paid workers are still going to be able to afford to pay more for their homes. Now, this may not be fair, but facts are facts. We know the rich keep getting richer, so the more highly skilled, highly paid workers are going to still be able to pay more, while the average working class Australian just won't have more money in their pockets to pay more for their homes. The value of the properties during the low interest rate environment went up more than their serviceability in those locations can. And that's why I believe if you're going to buy an investment, you should avoid blue-collar areas and even many of the regional locations, and avoid young family suburbs, and seek out suburbs where wages growth is higher than the state averages. That's the way you're going to outperform the averages. And these are locations where people can afford to and will be prepared to pay a premium to live there. And these are often the gentrifying middle ring capital city suburbs. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not just the owner-occupiers who are going to buy properties to push up values, but you also want your tenants to be able to afford to pay you more rent. Now, some people are going to say, but why would a tenant live in those locations? Why would they pay more rent if they can afford to? Lots of tenants rent not because they can't afford to buy, but because of lifestyle choices. Maybe they're moved interstate and they're waiting to settle down. Maybe they've just had a divorce. Maybe they're building a new house. At Metropole, we as you probably know, get involved in a lot of medium density developments for our clients. We build a lot of townhouses. I personally, Pam and I, are just completing 2 townhouse projects at the moment, which are in affluent middle ring suburbs, and we are getting very high rents for these from affluent families who sometimes want to live in the school zones that are there. Many of them, interestingly, I know from my own tenants, have got homes and their own investment properties, but choose to live in a location where they want to live, but can't afford to buy. That's called rent vesting, isn't it? Now, as we keep talking about the various factors that affect our property markets, I've gone through a number of the factors that affect things in the short term. But while they're important, I believe we should look for a moment at the 3 big factors that are going to increase property values over the long term. And one of them is what I've already mentioned, but let me go into a little bit more detail for you, and that's demographics. Because, as I've said a few times, demographics is what's going to drive our property markets. That's the data that describes the composition of the population, the age, the race, the gender, the income, the migration patterns, and the population growth. And as I've said, these factors are more significant than the ups and downs. If we're talking about the long term of the more significant than the ups and downs of interest rates, because that's what's going to affect the sort of properties that are going to be in strong demand and how they're going to be priced. That's because the demographics of a population doesn't just determine how many of us there are, but how we want to live and where we want to live. So, as I said, it's not just population growth, it's a household formation, as we said. So if we believe that over the long term there's going to be many more of us and there's going to be more skilled migrants coming in, working class people who have got jobs, then that's one of the factors that's going to underpin property values in the long term. Not only that, but the pandemic's induced a work-from-home movement that's changed demographics significantly, and now many workers are able to work from the comfort of their own home. They save on commuting, which means they need extra space. So the sort of property we're going to live in and where we're going to live is going to change as well. So demographics isn't just how many of us there are, but how we want to live and where we want to live. So we've seen this trend. In fact, the sea change and tree change trend started a couple of years ago, and it's made a lot of us reevaluate. The pandemic's made a lot of us reevaluate how we want to live. So many of us have upsized to larger homes. We've moved further out from the city. We've relocated to close to the CBD regional locations. But most important has been, and I'm sorry to go on about it again because you've heard me talk about it before, but the importance of neighbourhood. I don't think that's going to go away. So if we're looking at the 3 big trends that are going to drive property values in the long term, that are going to underpin the value of properties in some locations, it's demographics. And one of the demographic changes is the need to have a neighbourhood that's vibrant, that you enjoy living in, that is close by, and that's that 20-minute neighbourhood where you can walk, cycle, or drive public transport to a range of shops, a range of amenities, gyms, entertainment, and jobs as well. And that doesn't occur in the outer suburbs. The facilities just aren't there for it. So again, if we're talking about the 3 big factors driving the value of properties up over the long term, demographics, the population growth, and I've already explained to you that over the next couple of decades, Australia's got a business plan to grow our population significantly. The problem, of course, is where are we going to put them all? Because if we are going to grow our population back to the sort of rate we used to before, about 1.5% per annum, that's around 400,000 people. They're bringing it back to the pre-COVID levels of population growth. Think about it. That's the equivalent of adding a city the size of Canberra to our population every year. Now, the numbers are already starting to rise, but it seems to be taking longer for people to come to Australia. The visa hold-up is a real issue, isn't it? But since the phased reopening of our international borders, interstate migration is happening, and so is international migration. So if we believe Australia's population is going to keep growing, and we've got that business plan of growing by 350, 400,000 people a year up to the middle of this century, and you believe that we're going to remain a wealthy nation over the long term, that's going to underpin the long-term value of properties. Now, some people are saying, hey, property values can't keep going up. But again, it's all to do with supply and demand. And yes, Australian property values are expensive, but that's the cost of living in one of the best the best country in the world, and arguably the best time in history. So if we're talking about the three big factors driving our property markets, it's demographics, how we're going to live, where we're going to live, the sort of properties we want to live in, population growth, which is sort of related to demographics, and the wealth of the nation. There's a positive relationship between household income and housing demand. Australian property prices increase when we are wealthy and we feel wealthy, because there's that wealth effect that when people feel good and feel comfortable, our psyche in Australia is to improve our homes, to improve our standard of living, to have a bit more land around us, to live in a better location. So over the long term, as our economy continues to improve, our property values will continue to improve as well. The truth is, household wealth and property prices go hand in hand. So it's clear that as we move forward, they're the main factors that are going to affect our property values. So when you now think, should I get into the market or shouldn't I? You've heard me say before that we're currently experiencing a window of opportunity, a period of time when a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines waiting to hear it's all over. Things are not going to get worse. Now, that's going to happen sometime. I don't know exactly when, but I would suggest by the end of this year, inflation is going to peak, but we probably won't know about that until early 2023 because, there's a lag for the inflation data to come through. And I believe early next year, interest rates are going to peak. And when the world realizes that, when people think, hey, this is the worst is over now, the pent-up demand that's occurring now because people are sitting by the sidelines is going to come out and people are going to move on with their lives and property values are going to increase. So when you decide when you should get involved in the market, don't pay too much attention to the market. Don't pay too much attention to what's happening in the outside world. If you've got good income and if you can borrow sufficient to have a financial buffer to see you through the ups and downs, to see you through maybe slightly rising interest rates in the short term, get involved in the market when it suits you financially, not when the market suggests is right or wrong, because you can't pick the top or the bottom of the market. So first of all, look at the big picture. Look at the macroeconomic environment. And overall, even though the economy is going to slow down a little bit, there's no economic crash or recession in sight. Then look at the right state in which to invest, one that's going to outperform the Australian markets in average because of its economic growth and its population growth. And then within that state, look for suburbs that are going to outperform in the long term with regard to capital growth. And our research department at Metropole found that some suburbs outperform 50, even up to 100% more capital growth than others over a 10-year period. Look, during the boom, everything went up a year or two ago. That's not happening at the moment, is it? And the areas that are going to outperform will be where there's more owner-occupiers who want to live there because of lifestyle choices and where they're able to and prepared to and can afford to pay a premium to live there. As I've said before, these are often the gentrifying suburbs. But then even within that right suburb, look for the right location. You know it yourself, some livable streets are always going to perform others. At the moment, when there's no rush, there's no FOMO like a year or two ago, where there's a flight to quality, don't take shortcuts, only buy A-grade properties. And not just A-grade properties, but A-grade properties in A-grade locations. There will always be some properties that are more desirable than others, so look for the right property. And at the end, yes, the price is important, but I'm not suggesting buy a cheap property because there's always going to be cheap properties around in secondary locations. I mean buying a quality asset at the right price, one that appeals to owner-occupiers, one that's below intrinsic value so you're not paying a premium, one where there's a high land to asset ratio. Now, remember, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got a large block of land, but it should be where there's a large land component. And apartments have a land component, not if you've got 100 apartments in a block, but if you've got 8 or 10 in those older established flats, that we used to call them, family-friendly blocks of apartments. I own a lot of apartments, and they've made good investments. Of course, the area is important, but you also got to look for a property that's special too, maybe something with a twist, something unique, something a bit different about it. And I love properties to which I can add value through renovations or development. So I hope by going through these factors, I've just reminded you of some of the fundamentals. By the way, if you've been a long-term listener to this podcast, you've heard me say all of these things before. But the reason I've taken the time to have this one-on-one chat with you without other guests today is because I just wanted to go back to some of the fundamentals to remind you of the many factors affecting property values, much more than what the media is going to tell you. It's much, much more than interest rates. The problem is many of the people giving advice out there just have not lived through periods of inflation. Anyone who's bought a property in the last 10, 15 years has not even lived through a period of rising interest rates, let alone inflation. How can they advise you on this other than theoretically? Do you want somebody who's practicing, or do you want somebody who actually knows what to do? So if you're looking to get advice in these challenging times, if you're looking for certainty and direction, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole? We will help by putting a plan together and then helping you implement the plan. But it all starts with a free obligation-free chat. So go to metropole.com.au and have a complimentary clarity consultation where you can get an idea about what your options are, or we can have a look at your current property portfolio to see, is it going to get you to where you want to get to? So I hope now I've given you a little bit of clarity about what makes property values rise and I guess fall. So next, I just want to share with you my regular mindset message.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Today in my mindset message, I'd like to share with you a blog that I just recently read from Joe Polish, an American marketer, but it actually made me think, and I'd like you to see how his insights make you look at things in a different way. Because Joe Polish said, I like stress, but I don't like distress. He said, distress will tear you down. Stress, like working out, will make you stronger. You know, I guess he's right. Joe went on to say, I learned early on in my career to do one thing every day that scares you. He said, that means doing something challenging, because through challenge, you become better. And, you know, I guess he's right. There's a saying, life's not happening to you, it's happening for you. Now, interestingly, Joe Polish said one of his best friends, Dr. Sean Stevenson's last words to him before he died from a tragic accident were, this is happening for me, not to me. Well, I think that's a brave way of thinking about it. But I guess what Joe Polish was trying to say is when bad things happen, ask yourself, is this happening to me or for me? Listen, nothing feels good in the middle. You're going through financial challenges or bankruptcy. Well, that doesn't feel good. You're in the middle of a divorce. Well, boy, that feels terrible. You're in the middle of an illness. Nothing feels good in the middle. So in the middle, it requires a lot of courage. But when you're done, though, you learn from it. You grow from it. Now, unfortunately for Joe Polish's friend Sean, it was passing on. But interestingly, while facing death, he still centered himself. So if you can develop yourself to see things that happen in your life, even the most painful things, as there to help you, that will transform you. All of those things that seem to oppose your goals are actually the raw material for achieving them. Think about that. All the things that come at you that seem to oppose you, to slow you down from reaching your goals, are actually the raw material you need for achieving them. Thanks for spending the last 40 minutes or so with me, and if you got some benefit from today's show and you know somebody else who'd benefit from it, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. You're also helping me spread the word because I want to make more and more people financially independent. And that is possible in Australia, but you've got to get the right knowledge. So together, let's share that. And I love to see how so many more people are downloading the show. So I guess we're doing something right. So let's keep spreading the word. I'll be back again real soon, but I want to suggest that if you got some benefit, why not go back to some of the past episodes? Each one has got some lessons in it. Listen to them at 1.5 times speed. I sound pretty good that way anyway, and you can learn about property, success, and money. By the way, you can get a special report, a group of reports and some bonuses just for listening to my show. Go to podcastbonus.com.au and I've got a heap of reports for you. And I'll be back again real soon. But in the meantime, you can catch me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney or go to the Property Update private Facebook group. Go to Facebook, look for the Property Update Facebook group where every day I leave some information. As I said, I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?